Welcome back. Now in Afghanistan, a blast at a Kabul mosque during Friday prayers has killed at least 4 people. The Interior Ministry said dozens of others were wounded in the attack. The Taliban have denied involvement in the attack. Earlier, 9 Afghan soldiers were killed in a roadside bomb attack carried out by the Taliban in eastern Paktika province. The spike in violence comes as the Kabul administration and the Taliban gear up for intra-Afghan talks as part of the Doha peace deal. The Taliban have released 22 Afghan soldiers and police officers as part of a prisoner swap under the peace deal signed with the US in Doha. In a tweet, the group's spokesman Suhail Shaheen said the prisoners were released in Kapisa, Samangan and Parvan provinces. Earlier, the US hailed the release of prisoners by the Afghan administration as well as the Taliban. In a tweet, Washington's envoy Zalmay Khalilzad said the intra-Afghan negotiations must begin as soon as the prisoner swap completes. The exchange of detainees is part of a deal which the US had signed with the Taliban in February. Kabul has released more than 3,000 Taliban prisoners, while President Ashraf Ghani says 2,000 more will be freed soon. On the other side, the Taliban have also released more than 500 Afghan inmates. Pakistan has regretted the negative remarks by the Indian Ministry of External Affairs regarding Islamabad's goodwill suggestion. In a statement, Foreign Office spokesman said Pakistan wanted to share its successful experience in ameliorating the impact of COVID-19. Spokesperson Aisha Faruqi said MEA's remarks reflected an unprofessional attempt at point scoring over a serious issue. She said Prime Minister Imran Khan's suggestion was in the backdrop of a study that highlighted the worst impact of COVID-19 lockdown in India. Yesterday, Prime Minister Khan offered India to benefit from Pakistan's experience in helping the poor during the pandemic. Pakistan has reported a record 107 deaths from COVID-19 and over 6,000 infections in the last 24 hours. The Health Ministry says the country's death toll has risen to 2,463 with over 124,000 cases. The ministry said over 40,000 patients of coronavirus have recovered so far. The province of Punjab leads in the number of cases with over 47,000 cases so far. The southern province of Sindh has nearly 47,000 cases. Yesterday, Prime Minister Imran Khan warned of strict action against the business community for not following the COVID-19 SOPs. Now, the UK has recorded 202 more COVID-19 related fatalities over the past 24 hours, bringing the nationwide death toll to over 41,400. In Iran, there are 75 new deaths, pushing the total past 8,600. The US registered 910 fatalities, with the overall tally nearing 114,000. Worldwide, the death count has crossed 421,000, while infections are over 7.5 million. More in this report.
Countries are forced to choose between human and economic damage of COVID-19 as fears of a second coronavirus outbreak hit global shares. The UN says the economic fallout from the pandemic can plunge to an extra 395 million people into extreme poverty. While Latin America continues to be the virus epicenter, its worst hit country, Brazil, has reopened shopping malls in all major cities. The island nation of Cuba is looking forward to reopening its borders, but the government announced it will do so in phases.
During the first phase, we will not only restart tourism from the first phase. From the first day we say, it starts from this day. Tourism will open up, but what will open? How will it start? During that first phase, only the internal market will open. In other words, the national tourism, those who live in Cuba.
China has reported 7 new coronavirus cases, including the first instance of a local transmission in Beijing in weeks. Authorities said the other 6 cases were all brought into the country by Chinese citizens arriving from abroad. Meanwhile, South Korea has announced to extend its prevention and sanitation guidelines until daily new infections drop to single digits.
The government has decided to extend the current prevention and sanitation guidelines in the capital area while putting extra quarantine efforts after discussing with local governments in Seoul area.
Over in Australia, the federal government has stepped up pressure on state leaders to reopen internal borders to revive the country's economy. In Indonesia, hundreds of children have died from COVID-19, giving the country one of the world's highest rates of child deaths from the virus.
Now, Russia says keeping quiet about the Western coalition crimes in Iraq is impermissible and those responsible must be brought to justice. This comes after the UK said all inquiries and prosecution of British military personnel for crimes in Iraq will be wrapped up within weeks. In a news briefing, Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said it is unclear why the investigation of specific incidents and facts were being terminated. She said it is important to prevent crimes from being brushed under the carpet. The spokesperson questioned the justice of the Western coalition. Zakharova said UK's stance is clear evidence that London is determined to conceal numerous instances of disgraceful conduct by British troops in Iraq. Moving on, the US has promised to reduce its troops from Iraq over the coming months after talks with Baghdad. A joint statement of the strategic dialogue said Washington does not seek a permanent military presence in Iraq. It said the troops will be reduced over significant progress made in the fight against ISIS. While in return, Iraq promised to protect bases housing US troops under threat after a series of rocket attacks. Both countries also discussed Iraq's economic and energy crisis amid the COVID-19 pandemic. The two countries held their first strategic dialogue in more than a decade after the killing of Iranian commander General Qasem Soleimani. Iraq's delegation was led by Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs Abdul Karim Hashim, while Under Secretary of State David Hale led the U.S. team. And the U.S. has increased funding for its missile defense system in the National Defense Authorization Act for the fiscal year 2021. The U.S. Senate's Armed Services Committee approved the additional funds in a 25-2 vote. The draft bill summary provides additional funding for the hypersonic and ballistic tracking space sensor weapons, among others. The bill authorizes $1.4 billion for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative to send China a strong signal and defend the U.S. interests in the Indo-Pacific region. The legislation also mandates realigning and improving weapons capabilities in the region to blunt a possible offensive from Beijing. The law provides $9.1 billion to procure 95 Joint Strike Fighter aircraft, 14 more than the U.S. administration had actually requested. The International Criminal Court has criticized the U.S. sanctions as an unacceptable attempt to interfere with the rule of law. In a statement, the ICC said Washington's economic and travel restrictions against the court's employees amount to threats and coercion. The Hague-based tribunal said it will stand by its investigators and staff in the face of a series of unprecedented attacks on the court. Meanwhile, the European Union reassured the court of its steadfast support. The bloc's Foreign Affairs Minister Joseph Borrell said Washington's measures against the legal body are a matter of serious concern.
This is a matter of serious concern, as you can understand, because we, as European Union, we are steadfast supporters of the International Criminal Court. I think that for sure I can reiterate our support to this institution.
Earlier, U.S. President Donald Trump sanctioned investigators involved in an ICC inquiry into possible war crimes in Afghanistan. The Human Rights Watch condemned the move, calling it a blatant attempt at obstruction and contempt for the global rule of law. Now, moving on to North Korea, which has accused the U.S. of making empty promises, calling Washington a long-term threat to Pyongyang. In a statement, North Korea's Foreign Minister Ri Song-won said Pyongyang will develop more reliable military forces to counter Washington's threat. Ri said there was a little reason to continue the personal relationship between North Korea's Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un and U.S. President Donald Trump. It said the Trump administration was only focused on scoring political points by threatening Pyongyang with nuclear strikes and regime change. Meanwhile, a U.S. State Department spokesperson said Washington is committed to reaching a balanced agreement with Pyongyang. The bilateral tensions have been intensifying since the failed Vietnam summit between Kim and Trump in February 2019. UAE's envoy to US, Youssef Al-Otaiba, says Israel cannot expect to normalize relations with the Arab world if it annexes land in the occupied West Bank. In an article in the Israeli newspaper, Al-Otaiba said the move will be an illegal takeover of the land Palestinians seek for a state. It said the annexation will upend all Israeli aspirations for improved security, economic and cultural ties with the Arab world and UAE. The envoy said the move will undermine the changing opinion of the people about Israel. Israel has no diplomatic relations with Gulf Arab countries, but common concerns over Iran's regional influence have led to a thaw in ties. Indonesia says it has sent letters to the members of the OIC, UN Security Council and other global bodies to garner support against Israel's plans to annex occupied West Bank. In a statement, Indonesia's embassy in Turkey slammed Tel Aviv for endangering peace and stability in the region. It said that Israel is undermining efforts to reach a lasting political solution on the Palestinian issue. The letter by Indonesian Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi called on Ankara and the international community to support their commitment to Palestinians. It called on the world to turn down the annexation plan and work towards sustaining the two-state solution. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has announced that his government plans to annex all settlement blocks in the West Bank early next month. Moving on, the UN says cruise missiles used in Houthis' attacks on oil facilities and an international airport in Saudi Arabia last year were of Iranian origin. This comes as Washington pushes the UNSC to extend an arms embargo on Iran that is due to expire in October under the nuclear deal. In a report, Secretary General Antonio Guterres told the Security Council weapons that the US seized last year were also of Iranian origin. Guterres added the drones used in May and September attacks were also of Iranian origin. Iran's mission to the United Nations in New York did not immediately respond to a request for comment on the report. Now, Iran's United Nations in New York did not immediately respond. That was the last story. Now, moving on. The UN has expressed horror at reports of at least 8 mass graves discovered in Libya's Dahuna city. Last week, the country's internationally recognized government retook the area from Khalifa Haftar-led Eastern forces. In a tweet, the UN mission in Libya said the international law requires prompt, effective and transparent investigations into all alleged cases of unlawful deaths. The mission said it welcomes the Justice Minister's decision to establish a committee to look into the matter. It said it will provide all the necessary support to the government to probe the mass graves. The government of National Accord has claimed to find mass graves in areas controlled by Haftar's forces. It said the remains are those of imprisoned government soldiers as well as civilians. Anti-government protesters take to the streets in multiple Lebanese cities, setting up burning barricades and forcing road closures. A rapid fall in the currency and mounting economic hardship sparked the demonstrations. Roads were blocked in several areas, including a southern suburb of Beirut that is considered a Hezbollah stronghold. Protesters in Tripoli threw petrol bombs at a central bank building, prompting security forces to fire tear gas. The Lebanese pound slid to about $5,000 to dollar and has lost 70% of its value since October. The devaluation has increased inflation and unemployment in the crisis-hit country. More news to come after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Now, Venezuela's opposition has refused to comply with the Supreme Court's order to hand over the list of candidates for the electoral body. Lawmakers from the opposition-controlled National Assembly say the court is trying to derail the upcoming elections. This comes after Venezuela's Supreme Court ruled that the National Assembly had not named rectors to the National Electoral Council in time. The new parliamentary elections are due by the year, but the ongoing feud between the legislature and judiciary is likely to affect the polls. Opposition lawmaker Angel Medina said, in order to have a free election, the country needs a reliable electoral body. The opposition boycotted the 2018 presidential election amid concerns over possible rigging by Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro.
If we want to have a free electoral process, we have to start with the first step, which is to build a reliable electoral arbitrator for the country. In order to build that reliable electoral arbitrator for the Venezuelans, you must have a great political guarantee. A great guarantee with all the sectors. To see in those men and women who are going to become rectors of the National Electoral Council. The possibility of rescuing the vote as a mechanism of change. The possibility of helping the millions of Venezuelans inside and outside the country decide. Of course, we have had contact with the government with the premise of being able to advance this within a framework that guarantees that power be renewed, but is also the first step to achieve truly free elections.
Moving on, Pakistan says it remains committed to cooperating with all neighbors on controlling the locust threat. Foreign Office spokesperson Aisha Faruqi says Pakistan, India, Afghanistan and Iran have decided to revive communications at the level of Food and Agriculture Organization. Faruqi said all countries in South and West Asia have agreed to constitute a technical team to exchange information. She said Pakistan has been participating in these meetings on a weekly basis. The spokesperson said these exchanges are fruitful in sharing information in the bordering areas of Pakistan and India. Earlier, India's External Affairs Ministry said New Delhi has proposed to Pakistan to activate technical level meetings in the run-up to main meetings. It said the two states can undertake a joint locust control operation and facilitate the supply of pesticides. The EU Aviation Safety Agency has certified for flight the world's first fully electric aeroplane, the Pipistrel Velis Electro. In a statement, the aviation body said this will pave the way for environmentally sustainable and emission-free aviation. EASA Executive Director Patrick Kai said this is the first electric aircraft but won't be the last. Velis Electro is a two-seater aircraft intended primarily for pilot training. The certification process was completed in less than 3 years. New Zealand's North Island is suffering from a severe drought without any significant rainfall since last November. From January to April this year, Auckland had 77 consecutive days without rain, setting a record for the driest history. Details in this report.
Auckland is the largest city in New Zealand with 1.5 million people. Due to the coronavirus drought, the water storage to the city's two main water reservoirs has fallen severely. Relevant data shows that at present, the average storage capacity of the two reservoirs has dropped to 43%. This is the first time in more than 20 years that the storage has fallen below 50%.
Normally, our storage would have been around 75–76% full. So we've got a deficit, a shortage of 30% of storage because of the low rainfall.
The government has announced restriction on water usage. Residents are not allowed to use outdoor pipes to water flowers and plants, wash cars or clean ground and houses. Meteorological expert says climate change is an important factor causing the extreme weather.
June, maybe part of July, probably going to be a bit drier. We're hopeful, fingers crossed, that late winter, August, we start coming out of that dryness.
Farmers are especially hard hit by drought, with losses in agriculture expected to shave about 1% of economic growth. National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research says the North Island drought is the worst in 50 years.
In Brazil, the lagoons in the seaside of the capital Rio de Janeiro are filled with couches, toys and tires amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Up close, the waters are murky thick with sewage, discarded furniture and old toys. More details in this report.
The dolphins and sharks leaping and swimming in Rio de Janeiro's Guanabara Bay belie a dangerous problem of contamination. Pollution is an old problem of Brazil that has plagued the Bay and Tijuana and Jacarepagua lagoons. The recent worldwide pause and lockdowns of coronavirus pandemic has less impact on pollution reduction. Today, it remains littered with garbage, bottles, plastic bags, lids, shoes and tires.
Here, because of the lagoon system in the Jacarepagua lowlands, a neighborhood that borders the Jusa lagoon, the problem is garbage and sewage. People have not stopped going to the bathroom because of the pandemic. Now they go more because they are more at home. So the problems remain exactly the same, and unfortunately the garbage is still in the rivers.
Fishermen say there is a resurgence in marine life due to lockdown, but the pandemic appears to have made little dent in the pollution. A fisherman, Jesus Coutinho, works on the bay. He believes the coronavirus pandemic has largely helped worldwide environmental efforts.
This pandemic, on one hand, killed a lot of people, but on the other hand, it made a good contribution to nature.
According to statistics, Tijuana has 6.5 million cubic meters of mud and garbage, which grows with each new rain.
This is a garbage deposit where part of the population throws everything into the rivers, and the rivers end up like this.
According to the Bahia Viva environmental movement, pollution affects some 100 coastal lagoons of Rio de Janeiro state coast.
Business news coming up after a short break. Stay tuned. Pakistan has unveiled its federal budget for the fiscal year 2020-21 with a total outlay of more than $44 billion. At a budget speech, Industries Minister Hamad Azhar said the GDP growth for next fiscal year is targeted at 2.3%, and this adds contributions from agriculture, industry and services. It said the government projects growth of 2.1% for the next fiscal year, up from 0.4% contraction in the outgoing year. Azhar said the government has allocated $424 million to combat the coronavirus crisis, which has incurred a loss of $18 billion to the national income. The minister also said there is no new taxes being imposed in the budget. It said there is a 73% decline in the current account deficit, which is now under $3 billion. Now, for more on this, we are joined by financial expert Naseem Beg. Thanks for being with us. The government has imposed no new taxes in the federal budget for the fiscal year 2020-21. So what impact will it have on the general public?
Well, I would think that the public at large may have been expecting an increase in taxes, so they would be quite relieved. However, there is a targeted almost $1 trillion increase in revenue collection by the FBR. So that's going to be a challenge. With no new taxes, and to be, in fact, if you go into details, there is actually a reduction in some of the import duties, etc. So while one says no new taxes, I guess the minister meant no new income tax, etc. But there's a reduction in duties, etc. On the whole, the business, it's a business friendly, I should say, industry friendly budget, which really means that it's hoping on collecting from a wider scope of people. At the same time, depending on the last year collection, about 3.9 trillion versus 4.9 that we are going for now, means there needs to be a significant growth in economic activity. The target is, 2.4 or something like that, but it's going to be challenging, but of course it sounds good. On the other hand, to meet the type of deficit the government has, I would have thought that they would have had selectively taxed people who can afford to pay, not necessarily in the immediate future, but as the economy rolls out, perhaps later, and I wouldn't be surprised if they come back doing that.
Right. The government has also projected a growth of 2.1% this year, up for a 0.4 contraction in the outgoing year.
First of all, I'd like to say that putting up any target under the current circumstances is just a target. How realistic it is will depend on how things roll out in terms of just the disease and the impact it has on people, whether one has to go in for a second series of lockdowns, and it's not just lockdowns per se. It means the economic activity gets impacted, manufacturing gets impacted, agricultural side of the economy, how serious is the locust attack, how will that impact agriculture. So I would say that these are indicative numbers. One should not read too much into these other than saying that, okay, we are hoping for a recovery. Numbers, I think, are really not a realistic way of looking at it at this point in time.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Naseem Beg, for talking to Indus News. Now moving on, Islamabad has approved the construction of Khyber Pass economic corridor between Pakistan and Afghanistan. The Peshawar to Torkham project is expected to be completed by 2024 with a building cost of 65 billion rupees. Federal Minister Nurul Haq Qadri said the 48-kilometer project will comprise 4-lane expressway and an industrial zone. He said the project will usher into an economic revolution in the area. The minister said the corridor will link Central Asia with South Asian regions throughout Afghanistan and will be a guarantor of prosperity in the region. UK's economy has shrunk by 20.4% in April, the largest monthly contraction on record since 1997. The Office for National Statistics says historic fall due to COVID-19 lockdown affected virtually all areas of activity. The contraction is 3 times greater than the decline seen during 2008 financial crisis. The ONS said from February to April, economy declined by about 10.5% compared with the previous 3-month period. ONS Deputy National Statistician Rob Kent-Smith said April's fall in GDP brought the size of the economy to what it was in 2002. The Bank of England and the country's budget office have warned Britain can be heading for its deepest recession in 3 centuries this year. Now, the European Commission says there is still much work needed to strike a trade deal between Britain and the EU. At a news conference, Commission Vice President Maros Sefcovic said the window of opportunity is closing for London before Brexit transition ends. He said London had no intention of extending the transition period beyond end of 2020, as communicated by a British minister. Sefcovic said he is hopeful that Monday meeting would lead to a fresh momentum on the UK side. Meanwhile, the International Monetary Fund says governments around the world have spent $10 trillion to combat COVID-19 pandemic and its economic fallout. In a blog, Fund's Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva wrote further efforts are needed to contain the fallout. Georgieva said it is very likely IMF will further cut its April forecast for 3% contraction in global output. She said to promote a more inclusive recovery, further spending should focus on minimizing job losses and preventing a rise in inequality. Georgieva said COVID-19 crisis is inflicting the most pain on those who are already vulnerable, which can lead to a significant rise in income inequality. The US stocks have opened sharply higher a day after their biggest one-day dive in 3 months over fears of COVID-19 resurgence. Big U.S. lenders, including Bank of America, Citigroup and Morgan Stanley, rose between 3 and 5% in pre-market trading. The shares of Boeing also jumped over 6%. The indices of S&P 500 and the Nasdaq Composite traded over 1.5% higher. The Dow Jones Industrial Average Index also climbed to nearly 2%. Meanwhile, oil prices dropped, with Brent crude trading at $38 a barrel. Now it's time for the weather update across the globe. Well, that's all for now. For the latest updates, you can always follow us on social media at indus.news. Take care.